Originally, I wanted to make the Renaissance a lot more digestible by dividing it into three parts, focusing on the 12th century Renaissance, the Italian Renaissance, and then the Northern Renaissance. But I didn't have time, so I figured that it would just be best to try to cover everything all at once. After all of these events and developments are all related. So basically what we're going to do is look at the development of European culture from about 1100 to 1600, and this could be a mess, but hopefully we'll get through all of the key concepts and touch on enough of the key thinkers that you have a general idea for what was going on there in this period and why it matters. So let's get this going. Let's explore the key phases and concepts that we're talking about in this video. First of all, what is a Renaissance? A Renaissance is a rebirth in the most broad sense possible. And in this case, we're talking about the rebirth of ancient culture and the integration of Greek and Latin text into the medieval Western conscious to create something new, which emerges as the early modern European intellectual world. Now, once we have this idea of Europe being reborn and sort of reuniting with its ancient past, this creates what we see as the divide between antiquity, the Middle Ages, and then modernity. No one knew that they were living in a Middle Age which connected two things. That's sort of a view of people starting in the Renaissance period when they look back and they said, hey, well, there was a large gap of stuff that was just this filler material in the middle, and there was this great time in the antiquity, and now there's a great time either now or in the near future. So that's where this concept of Middle Ages comes from. It actually doesn't exist as an idea until we have the Renaissance and it's fairly well progressed, and we'll talk about that concept more as we go along. Now let's look at the three phases of the Renaissance that we're going to actually look at. There's the Renaissance of the 12th century. This is basically a period of the rediscovery of text. There's the Italian Renaissance, when we sort of see the flip switch and we go beyond just rediscovering text and we actually get more creative. We see that people start to integrate ancient ideas into their own thinking and then try to progress from that point in new and creative ways. Then the Northern Renaissance is basically when the Renaissance spreads out of Italy and reaches places like the Netherlands and Poland and all kinds of other places. The Netherlands and Poland I mentioned because those are two places I get into in this video, but they're not necessarily the only places where the Renaissance takes place. So anyway, let's go now and look at the conditions and circumstances which underlie the Renaissance. So let's look at the conditions and circumstances which allowed the Renaissance to happen. Now, like all great periods of cultural flowering, there was a lot of economic gain, and that created enough leisured wealth for people to then explore the world intellectually because they weren't worried about starving to death. In the case of the Renaissance, a lot of it involved people having excess wealth and then using that wealth to gain prestige by paying other people to make discoveries in their name. We also see that the growth of trade and cities really increases literacy. When you're running a large trading business, you need to have detailed records and manifest. So you need literate people to run that. And once you have that basic level of literacy, you might want to read other stuff. So now there's an audience for things if you write them. So that's always a plus. We also see that what happens during the Renaissance is that whereas learning had more or less been confined to the Catholic Church during the Middle Ages, now we'll see sort of an outgrowth where learning becomes a secular pursuit as well. That is a long process, however. We also see one of the main components of the Renaissance, unsurprisingly, is a renewed interest in the ancient world, and that's part of why the Italian Renaissance was one of the biggest and best-known phases of this process. The Italians were very conscious of their Roman heritage, and the signs of it were all around them. And that was true to a differing extent, I guess is the best way to phrase it, for pretty much everybody in Europe, at least along the in the territories of the former Roman Empire. This is also a period where we have Arab and Byzantine scholars in text who are in contact with the West, and this allows for the rediscovery of Greek and Roman learning. So people are rediscovering their own cultural heritage, and they're also importing ideas from the Arabs and other neighboring powers. So, more or less, here's how the people of the Renaissance got back their Greek and Roman stuff. Science and philosophy tended to be studied a lot by the Arabs, so they had manuscripts that the West could use. But if you wanted history, drama, or rhetoric, that was pretty much all preserved by the Byzantines. So those are where the Greek text came from when they were recovered from the 12th century forward. Although he died in the 4th century BCE, Aristotle is absolutely central to this whole process. When his texts are rediscovered, most of his science would be rediscovered from the Arabs, and then most of his other stuff would be discovered from the Byzantines. This really transforms the intellectual landscape of Europe. He has an approach to logic and metaphysics which is different than that of Plato, and Plato had been sort of the go-to non-Christian philosopher for the West for quite a while because Boethius had made some translations of Plato in the early Middle Ages into Latin. But now that Aristotle is coming back, this will totally change the way that people think about the nature of God and stuff like that. In addition, Aristotle is known to look at things empirically rather than abstractly. Plato tended to look at things in terms of ideal forms. Aristotle tends to favor empiricism and observation. So you can see how this new focus on empiricism and observation will lend itself well to going in a more scientific direction. Also, Aristotle in many ways is an archetype for the Renaissance man. If you look up the Aristotelian corpus, you'll see that Aristotle was interested in everything from animals to physics to metaphysics to constitutional histories to what makes a work rhetorically effective to any given topic. So this sort of broad-ranging intellectual approach is something that will have a lot of appeal in the Renaissance, and we'll see that some people like Leonardo da Vinci in many ways will be the Aristotle of their own day, and they will try to know everything that there is to know about the world regardless of its field or genre. So let's look at the Renaissance of the 12th century, which actually begins a full 50 years before the 12th century and probably continues a full 50 years after it. So why it's called the 12th century Renaissance, I don't know. I didn't name it. Alright, but then again, we've already talked about the 100 Years' War, and that actually wasn't 100 years, and it wasn't one war. So, a lot of labels that are common in history are not 100% accurate, but let's just ignore that and move on. So basically, the 12th century Renaissance, by and large, is a classical revival where the West is starting to rediscover a lot of old Greek and Latin text, and they're getting them mostly from the Islamic world, both in Spain and in the Middle East, but mainly in Spain. And the special focus of the 12th century Renaissance is the recovery of Greek philosophy and science. Of course, the biggest name in that group by far is Aristotle. There also was some transmission of Arabic learning. So during this period, the West was introduced to Arabic numerals and algebra, which were both invented in the 9th century by the Islamic scholar Al-Khwarizmi. So this is the first time that the West would have an encounter with that. We also see in the 12th century that there emerges a sort of dichotomy between the highest levels of the elite and then the people who are semi-elite. And that takes the form of the people who are at the very top, the sort of international elite, the top scholars, the leading churchmen. They will write in Latin. And that will be for a fairly narrow audience. But then, the people who are writing locally and writing for, the literate merchant types, they will be writing in vernacular languages like Spanish or Italian or English rather than in Latin. Because, it's easier to learn a language you actually speak than one that people haven't really spoken for a while. One that's only spoken in church settings by a handful of elites who are kind of cloistered away from the world. So that's why vernacular starts to take off, because you have a lot of people who have literacy and some education, but they're not scholars. We also see that one of the chief forms of the 12th century Renaissance is that it produces a lot of poetry. And a lot of that poetry features courtly love, it's about partying, and it takes some satirical stabs at the church. This is also the period where a lot of the Arthurian legends are really recorded, and we see courtly love as exhibited by Lancelot and Queen Guinevere and all that kind of stuff. And we also see one of the biggest changes is that nobles start to expand their range of interest. So now, rather than just being interested pretty much in just war, they have some non-military interest as well. So now nobles are interested in things like literature and poetry and history and things like that. So this is sort of just a general expansion of the Western mind, and this takes place on a fairly small scale. But then later, when we get to the Italian Renaissance, we'll see that this process will just intensify and expand its scope and ambition dramatically. The most important institutional change of the 12th century Renaissance was the emergence of the early university. And these early universities catered to students who were in their late teens or early 20s, so basically the same age range as the modern university. And because all of these universities were sponsored by churches, they required their students to take a low-level cleric vow, so they were technically a part of the church, kind of. And if you wanted to teach as a professor, you also had to take a similar vow. Now, students, surprisingly, were the first to sort of start to organize this into something that we would recognize as a modern institution. So they would form strong student associations, and they mostly were there to make sure that they didn't get price gouged on housing or food while they were staying at university towns. At this time, there was little to no tuition, and as I said, most of these schools are sponsored by the church and by donors who would donate to this purpose. During this period, education was actually viewed as a gift from God, so it was seen as inappropriate to charge people money for learning. Now, students were still on the hook for providing their own room and board. There were no dorms until a little later at the University of Paris. So either you had to work locally to earn your keep, or you had to receive money from your parents, who often would live halfway across Europe. Professors surprisingly didn't organize until later, and when they organized, it was to set standards for themselves. So they would institute exams that would allow you to become a professor, so that way there was a standard for people in their field. That was a common practice in the Middle Ages where guilds were strong, where you would have a sort of standardized way for measuring skill and competence. So it is kind of surprising to me, though, that professors took longer to organize than the students. I don't know how you guys feel about that, but for me that seems like kind of a surprise. So, what were students hoping to accomplish by going to the universities during this period? For the most part, what they were looking to do is enter into either government service or join the church. And during this period, we see that as the level of learning rises, that you can get a competitive edge by joining a university and, receiving instruction. You also could use your education at a university to become a private tutor to some high-ranking noble or royal, or you could, in turn, become a professor at one of these universities. You also, if you are ambitious when it comes to becoming a great writer or scholar, this is where you would go to gain the skills you would need to really do that to full effect. So let's look at the difference between a basic and an advanced university education during this period. So basically, the sort of what we might call the equivalent of a BA at this time, you would study 7 fields of study, the trivium and the quadrivium. So the trivium is grammar, rhetoric, and logic. Basically, the stuff that your verbal reasoning skills, I guess is the best way to put it. And the quadrivium is more of the mathematically based educations. That's your arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music. If you wanted to go on for what was the equivalent of a PhD, then you were looking at 3 fields of choice. You had law, medicine, and theology. And because this is the Middle Ages and the Catholic Church is culturally dominant, it shouldn't come as too much of a surprise that theology was considered to be the most prestigious and important of these three fields. Also, if you think about it, law is mostly controlled by kings and nobles, so you're not going to have any 12 angry men scenarios. And medicine is not really all that advanced, so you're not going to be able to cure most illnesses if you become a doctor. So it kind of makes sense why theology would be a desirable field of study, since you actually can write stuff and hope maybe get accepted. And for a lot of students, it's kind of like today. I mean, it's part of growing up sometimes. It's an adventure away from home. You can try new things, you can meet new people, you can stay in a foreign land, you can learn new languages, develop new skills. For some people, it was simply a journey of self-discovery. And if you're from a wealthy family, you could afford to do that. So this is why people were going to college at the time, more or less. So let's think about how a university classroom actually works in the Middle Ages. When we think of lectures today, we tend to think of either a professor writing out what they want to say, or they do what I'm doing now, and I just have a PowerPoint with some bullet points, and then I kind of expand upon what I have up here. Well, a medieval lecture was a lot less prepared. The word lecture is actually derived from the Latin word legere, which means to read. So professors would simply take a book, read aloud from it, and offer comments as they read. And this was the origin of the scholarly gloss. And there are glosses available of many texts today that you can get, which are, full of commentary from various scholars. Some of them are useful, some of them are kind of useless. It just depends. Anyway, so if you're a student, what is your experience like? Well, chances are you're not going to be able to take notes fast enough to keep up, and you also don't own a text of the book that's being read to you. So the key is having a very good memory and being a very good listener. And if you're a professor, one of the keys is really just repeating your points over and over and over to hammer them home. Some professors actually still do that, and you basically get 1 point out of a lecture like 15 or 16 million times. The other factor, which is pretty useful, is that if you know everybody in your audience is going to have to rely on memory and they can't come back and play a video again or, read a book and find this information on their own, you need to keep your lecture short. So one of the reasons why students organized is so that they could find professors who lectured too long. There's only so much you can remember no matter how good your memory is. And in a world where literacy was more limited due to the cost of printing and the availability of paper, memories were generally better than they are today when it comes to that kind of thing. The problem is, there's still a limit, and there's only so much you can take in and retain at any one time, especially when you're going to have to take an exam on that at some point. So, which university actually got the ball rolling for setting the standards of medieval education? It was actually the University of Bologna. They're the first ones to have this sort of style of student government and administration. Originally, there were two associations at the University of Bologna. There were students from Italy itself, and then students who were from over the Alps. So basically, domestic students and foreign students. And in the 12th century, those two bodies merged, and they formed a universitas. And universitas just means united or whole or something of that nature. Universal is obviously another word that's derived from that. And the combination of these two bodies of students was called a university. Obviously, today we don't think of universities as just being bodies of students. We think of them more as sort of brick and mortar institutions. But back then, that was more of the concept, is that this is the unification of the student body. And Bologna would become most famous in the Middle Ages for having a law school, so if you were going to try to become an expert in law, Bologna was a great option. And if you wanted to learn medicine, one of the best places to go is Toledo in Spain, because there you have a lot of access to Greek texts, such as Hippocrates and Galen, which would be available in Latin. Those, of course, were originally written in Greek during antiquity, and for quite a while, they would remain pretty relevant for the study of medicine until they were replaced by Renaissance era thinkers who managed to advance the ball to a greater degree. So from Bologna, a bunch of other places started to copy their model, and higher education spread throughout most of Western Europe. And this included Northern Europe, which was a little bit behind, but not by all that much. Oxford apparently dates itself to 1096, although there's some evidence that it really didn't become very big until about 100 years later. Paris, the University of Paris is pictured here. That started around 1150 or so. There's the University of Cambridge, which was originally founded in 1209, but then given a royal charter in 1231. University of Seville, 1505. University of Leiden, 1575. And these are just some random examples. The point is that throughout this long period of the Renaissance, we see that higher education continues to expand both in terms of concentration and geographical spread. There also are universities opening up in Poland and all kinds of other places as well. So I've just given you a very limited sample size here to get the general idea across. So now it's time to look at the Italian Renaissance. The Italian Renaissance is so well known that when most people just reference the Renaissance in an offhanded, unqualified way, they're mostly talking about what happened in Italy. The Italian Renaissance begins around the year 1300 or so. That date is sort of debatable, and it lasts until the early 17th century, which again is another date that's kind of debatable and arbitrary. But it's clear that there are about 300 years of Italian history, give or take, which could qualify as being part of the Renaissance. Italy has pretty much the ideal circumstances for a Renaissance. It's wealthy, it has a lot of cities, it's a trade hub, it has political competition, which means that you can get ahead by being a great patron of the arts, and geographically it's situated in the middle of the Mediterranean. So it's near the Islamic world and the Byzantine world, and it's the place that most fleeing Byzantine scholars visit when they're fleeing from the Ottomans and from their own intellectual environment, which was becoming increasingly hostile. And obviously, because Italy was once the center of the Roman Empire, this is another place where there's a lot of classical interest. And the basic pattern of the Italian Renaissance is that we go from classicism, the studying of the classics and just sort of celebrating antiquity for the sake of antiquity, and then we move from that to when people take the knowledge that they gain from classical learning and then they apply it in new and creative ways, and that results in things like discoveries and innovations in art and literature. So now let's look at how the arts are funded during the Renaissance. So if you weren't part of the leisured nobility, but you had talent as a writer or as an artist, how would you get funded? Well, the answer is simple. You would find a patron of some kind. And if you're a patron, why would you want to sponsor someone? Because it's a great way to advertise that you're powerful, important, and that you're generous, and that you want to fund things which in some way beautify or enhance the life of the place where you live. So in the 12th century, at this point, the patronage system is still kind of developing. And at first what happens is that writers will write a work and then at the end dedicate it to some powerful person and hope that person will then reward them in some way monetarily. So for instance, if you write a work about the history of your land, you might dedicate it to a leading politician or to a king or a duke or whoever, in the hopes that this person will then reward you after seeing your work. But during the Italian Renaissance, things shifted. And what you have is that writers and artists will tend to be supported by a patron before they start working on a project. And because they have a patron who they're usually living with or getting paid by, the patron will kind of dictate to some extent the kinds of stuff that the artist or writer will do. But again, these are sort of general trends and they're not universally true. There also are plenty of great Renaissance artists who were commissioned by the church rather than by some private patron. So, again, we're talking about generalities and things that are more or less usually true, but not always true. Let's talk about Dante's Divine Comedy. Dante Alighieri was born in 1265 and he died in 1321. Just like pretty much everybody we're going to talk about today, he was born in Florence. For some reason, a ridiculous number of Renaissance thinkers were Florentine. Dante is known for quite a few things, but the thing that really stands out and gives him a place in history is the Divine Comedy. And some scholars actually view the Divine Comedy as being the sort of bridge which connects the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. And the reason for that is that in his work we see all of the elements which characterize both. So on the one hand, you have medieval Christianity and courtly love. Dante is actually guided by his former crush, a crush he had as a child, when he goes to heaven. And we see that only Christians can get into heaven, and that anyone who was born and lived before Christianity is stuck in limbo. We also see that you have purgatory and hell, depending on how bad your sins were. And those are all very traditional Christian ideas that had emerged by this time. But for most of his journey, he's guided by the Roman poet Virgil, the author of the Aeneid, and the person who inspired him the most. And when he reaches the inner circle of hell, the people who he sees as the worst offenders of all, traitors, are none other than Brutus and Cassius, who betrayed Julius Caesar and famously murdered him after he spared them during the Roman Civil War. So we see that not only that Dante is sort of like the first person who was classically informed and then used his classical knowledge to a creative end. So that's sort of why he is the first Renaissance thinker. But we also see that he's a product of his time, and he shows most of the characteristics that we associate with a medieval thinker. So I think he's as good of a start as any, and he's also a great example of a transitional figure. Let's now look at Dante's fellow Florentine, Petrarch. Petrarch was born in 1304 and died in 1374. He is sort of the first classicist in the sense that most of his activity, or at least a lot of it, revolved around studying Latin literature. His favorite author was Cicero, and it's largely because of Petrarch's efforts and arguments that Cicero is generally seen as kind of the quintessential Latin author. And when we learn Latin in schools, we focus very heavily on how Cicero did things, and we see that as sort of the correct way, or the most correct way at least, because Latin actually has fewer formal rules than you would expect if you're only familiar with modern languages. At any rate, let's not detour too badly. Petrarch is also pretty well known for the poetry that he wrote in Italian, and that would become pretty important later on for Italian literature. Petrarch is often considered to be the first humanist, and he's sometimes also seen as the father of the Renaissance. And as a humanist, by the way, this doesn't necessarily mean what people mean by the word humanist today. Usually today, humanist denotes a secular worldview, but Petrarch and most of his fellow humanists back in the Renaissance were all ardent Catholics. So that is a distinction that needs to be made. Now, one of Petrarch's other claims to fame is that he's pretty much the first person who characterizes the period after Rome's fall as a dark age, and then sees his own age as sort of a continuation of that darkness. And when people follow Petrarch and they adopt this similar gloomy attitude about how, the world has fallen culturally since the, demise of Rome, they begin to see the period between the fall of Rome and their own time as a Middle Age, which is just kind of this unnecessary, long, boring period that no one cares about because all the action was either in the distant past or in the present when we're rediscovering all this stuff. So sort of that negative connotation that people have when they talk about the Dark Ages and the Middle Ages, that only existed from the time of Petrarch on. Obviously, people living in the Middle Ages didn't know they were living in the Middle Ages. You can only know something is the middle of a transition once you're past the point when the transition has occurred, for the most part. I mean, you can guess, I suppose, but normally you have to get on the other side of it before you can say, hey, 20 years ago was a transition to an internet-based society, or whatever, right? You know what I'm talking about. Next up is yet another person from Florence. This time we're talking about a younger contemporary of Petrarch named Giovanni Boccacio. He is someone who lived from 1313 to 1375, and he is a creative writer who managed to break away from the traditional forms of literature, and he is also a writer who wrote in vernacular Italian. He has two especially famous works. One is the Decameron, and the other one is On Famous Women. The Decameron is a story about a bunch of people who are holed up during the Black Death, and they're telling stories about love and other stuff. It's kind of the Italian equivalent of the Canterbury Tales. On Famous Women is about the lives of women who were famous. And the reason why this is sort of innovative is that it was not common in a male-dominated society to talk about the contributions or achievements of women, but Boccaccio was fairly open-minded, and he saw that women made contributions. Boccaccio was also a rich dude, so he patronized the Greek scholar, and that guy made some limited translations of Euripides, the playwright, Aristotle, and Homer. And along with Dante and Petrarch, Boccaccio is known as one of the three fountains or the three crowns. And later on, people who wanted to systematize vernacular Italian would look to these three writers and then form sort of the basis for what standardized Italian should be. And now let's talk about someone who was a famous artist. His name is Donatello. He was born in Florence, shocker, in 1386, and he died in 1466. Now, Donatello spent most of his younger years studying classical sculpture, and later he would take the classical forms and then improve upon and change them to develop a distinctive Renaissance style of sculpture. Donatello was pretty talented. He could work with stone, bronze, wood, clay, stucco, wax, pretty much any material. Most sculptors pretty much have a preferred material, and that's what they're limited to, but Donatello could use any of them, and he also could do reliefs pretty well. I didn't include any reliefs on this slide, but they are out there if you're willing to look for them. And now it's time to look at the archetypical Renaissance man, Leonardo da Vinci. No one had a broader range of interest than Leonardo. He is the Aristotle of the Renaissance era. He lived from 1452 to 1519. He was born, shockingly, in Florence, or at least very near to it. He actually was an illegitimate son of some minor official, and then he went on to become arguably one of the greatest scholars in Western history. As I mentioned earlier, this guy has an all-encompassing range of interest. You think about anything from math to astronomy to mechanics, literature, history, philosophy. Leonardo's into it, and he knows a lot about it. It doesn't even matter what it is. Leonardo is, the ultimate Renaissance man. He's interested in everything. But the thing that he's best known for is his work as a painter. He painted the Mona Lisa, pictured here, the Vitruvian Man, which is a picture of a guy going through a range of motion, showing his muscles and everything else. Leonardo was especially sophisticated at figuring out how to draw muscles and figure out movement. He also has a famous sketch of a horse with all of its various muscles and tendons done correctly, which is something that was apparently hard to master for most artists. And of course, he has the Last Supper, which some crazy people say contains a hidden code about Jesus or something. I don't know. The Da Vinci Code is fiction, sorry to say. Anyway, one other thing that Leonardo is famous for is that he was an inventor who liked to sketch ideas for various sophisticated machines that actually couldn't be built with the technology of the time. He thought of things like helicopters, submarines, armored vehicles, all kinds of crazy stuff that was way ahead of his time, and it really speaks to the range of his intellect and creativity that he was even able to envision something like that before there was a sufficient propulsion system to even make something like that remotely plausible. Another great Florentine thinker was Niccolo Machiavelli, and yet again, Niccolo was from Florence. He lived between 1469 and 1527. Now, Machiavelli was a minister of the Florentine government during one of the periods when the Medici were out of power, and then when they came back, he was on the outs. He wrote The Prince shortly after his political career ended, and in The Prince he lays out the possibilities of statecraft if you are a ruler. The things that you can do to either gain power, hold on to power, or advance the interest of your state. And the things that he lays out as options, he doesn't actually say that you have to do the most cunning thing possible. He says that you should simply consider it as an option. This becomes known as realpolitik, the idea being that rather than seeking to do what is the most just or most right action, you should also consider things which are shadier, things which are nastier. So you should consider things like betraying a minister if that minister's downfall could advance the interest of the state as a whole, even if that downfall in itself is unjust. But again, to be fair, many people use the term Machiavellian to denote evil, but what Machiavelli is simply pointing out is that you have options, and that not all of those options are things that are in the Boy Scout handbook. So again, to be clear, he does say that whenever possible you should do what is morally right. But people never want to see that part, they just want to talk about the nasty stuff. And he also wrote two other works that are relatively famous, The Art of War and The History of Florence. Michelangelo was born in 1475 and he lived until 1564. He is a famous sculptor, painter, architect, and poet, and he hailed from the city of Florence, which is really shocking considering how few Renaissance thinkers had an association with Florence. So, Michelangelo, even though he lived to be about 89 years old, was already famous before he was 30, and he had already completed two of his better-known sculptures by then. His biggest achievements, however, were the Sistine Chapel, which he also did relatively early in his career, from 1508 to 1512. I have that on the next slide. And the other thing that he's most famous for came late in his life when he helped to design the Dome of St. Peter's Basilica, which still stands and can be pictured on your screen right here. Now, the interesting thing about Michelangelo that makes him stand out from the other Renaissance thinkers is that he had such a difficult personality, I guess what you might call an artist temperament, that he was basically impossible to get along with, and he didn't really have any students. He also was very ascetic, so despite the fact that he was rich, he lived a very rough lifestyle, and he also was not someone who had any manners. So he'd bark at people and be, like he didn't act like a man of refinement, and people hated to be around him. But his artistic genius was undeniable, and that's why he kept getting commission after commission. And here's the famous ceiling of the Sistine Chapel that Michelangelo painted for 4 years between 1508 and 1512. If you look at sort of the center right of that painting as it appears on your screen, you'll see the famous picture where God reaches out and touches fingers with the nude man. That, of course, was a part of the Sistine Chapel. And of all of the pieces of Michelangelo's art, that seems to be the thing which appears the most in both art books and in popular culture. The last thinker of the Italian Renaissance that we'll look at is the famous painter and architect Raphael. Now, unlike the other people who inspired the names of Ninja Turtles, Raphael was actually born in Urbino rather than Florence. So he is the outlier. And he only lived to be 37. He lived between 1483 and 1520. He was actually a bitter rival of Michelangelo, and the two people really despised each other pretty profoundly. I'm not sure if Raphael was as difficult as Michelangelo, and I don't think it necessarily implies that he was, because everybody had friction with Michelangelo. Raphael is the guy who gave us the School of Athens, the picture that I used as my title slide. And in the School of Athens, it is sometimes speculated that Raphael would design some of the ancient Greek thinkers after Renaissance thinkers that he knew or had seen. So some people have speculated, for instance, that Plato, as pictured in the center of the School of Athens, was actually modeled after a picture of the old Leonardo da Vinci. But, again, kind of speculative. And it also looks like Raphael might have worked himself into the design of the School of Athens on the side. But, I don't know. I'm not an art expert. You can decide for yourself. Let's shift our attention north to what are known as the Low Countries. And the Low Countries correspond with the modern countries of Belgium and the Netherlands. And during this period, this area had independent city-states and political conditions which are fairly similar to those of Italy. You have a lot of trade, you have cities which govern themselves and have their own armies, and you have these cities being threatened by three much bigger powers on their borders who often threaten or even successfully end their political independence. Those powers being the Holy Roman Empire, France, and England. And of those powers, France was generally the best organized and the biggest threat. But that, just like in Italy, political instability and the threat of outside invasion did not prevent a cultural flowering. So between about the late 15th and early 16th century, we see that Dutch painters and intellectuals will begin to gain international acclaim that is comparable to that of their Italian counterparts. And this is sometimes referred to as the Dutch Renaissance, and more broadly speaking, it is part of the Northern Renaissance, since the Netherlands is only one of the many areas which will experience a Renaissance, but we're mostly going to focus on the Dutch. And then we'll briefly touch base in Poland as well before we're done. The most famous figure from the Dutch Renaissance, I think without much question, would have to be Desiderius Erasmus of Rotterdam, who lived between 1466 and 1536. And he is basically the greatest of all of the Renaissance humanists, including probably even more influential than Petrarch in the long run. Now, by this point, humanists had really been studying Greek and Latin texts for a while, and they had gained an appreciation for how to correct manuscripts and how to compare them and get the most accurate readings that they could. And Erasmus is the start of really trying to form critical editions of text, or not necessarily the start, but one of the best practitioners of it during his day. So he'll spend a lot of his career just producing more refined Greek and Latin texts of the Bible, and that's still an ongoing process that classic scholars and Bible scholars are involved in, but Erasmus is one of the guys who really moves the ball forward more than most. He also wrote some other works in praise of folly and on free will. Those are basically religious or philosophical in nature, and those are more like original compositions. These were also famous throughout Europe, just like his translation work. Not his translation work, but his textual work, Now, as a philosopher and a theologian, Erasmus tried his best to steer a middle course between the Catholic Church, which was really in crisis. This is during the early phases of the Reformation, where Martin Luther and his followers, or mainly just his followers, were rebelling against the Catholic Church. And so what Erasmus tries to do is he tries to say, yes, the Catholic Church has its problems, but I'm going to stick with them. I'm not going to go with the Protestants. And that's a lot of the context for his religious writings. So he's a very fascinating figure. And if you really want to appreciate him more fully, you would probably have to have a stronger grasp of the Reformation, which I'm not going to get into. Thanks for asking, but no, we're not going there right now. Another famous Dutch Renaissance thinker was Gerardus Mercator, who lived between 1512 and 1594. He was the guy who came up with the Mercator projection, and this is basically a big flat map where things are as simply laid out as possible for the sake of navigation. So at the expense of geographical accuracy, you lay things out in a way which makes it easy for sailors to figure out where they are and what they need to do to get to their desired destination. Obviously, because of the distortion that the Mercator projection causes, if you've seen a Mercator map, you know that according to the Mercator system, Greenland is pretty much the same size as like South America, which is not accurate. But again, this is an instrument for practical purposes and not a completely 100% true to life representation of what the Earth looks like. If you want to see what the Earth actually looks like, you need to get a globe. The Mercator map is simply for navigation. Another well-known figure in the Dutch Renaissance is Andreas Vesalius. He lived between 1514 and 1564, and he was born in Brussels. So he is a Dutchman who lived in what is now Belgium. And that should not confuse you too much, because if you look at modern Belgium, it's basically half Dutch, the northern half, leading towards the Netherlands, and half French, the bottom half leading towards France. So, and there's also a German section, shockingly, in the east. But at any rate, let's get back to Vesalius. So Vesalius is most famous for writing the book on the fabric of the human body, and he performed a lot of dissections and other things where he would study anatomy. And because his work was so far superior to what had come before it, he is often referred to as the father of modern anatomy. One of the defining characteristics of the Dutch part of the Northern Renaissance is that it produced a lot of painters, and a lot of those painters were really big fans of pastorals. They would just draw peaceful country settings, and everything would kind of look, natural. But one guy who flew in the face of this was Hieronymus Bosch, and he lived between 1450 and 1516, and he's known for having an unusual and distinctive art style where he focuses on the fantastic and the macabre, and he's just someone who kind of flew in the face of what everyone else was doing, and that's why he became famous. He did stuff that other people dared not do, and that they didn't even imagine possible. The Renaissance also spread to other parts of Europe, including places that had never been touched by the Romans, like Poland. So the Polish Renaissance is mostly centered around the court at Krakow, where the kings and various nobles at court would prove to be great patrons of artists and intellectuals, and a lot of these artists and intellectuals would travel from the Netherlands or from Italy or from other areas and spend time at the Polish court. This is also a period in Polish history where we see an emergence of lots of educational institutions, and we also see the teaching of the classics. And on the map, we see the time when Poland and Lithuania were joined into one big state. And this is what it would look like if this existed in the modern world, if we compare it to modern national boundaries. And of course, whenever you have the promotion of education and the patronizing of the arts, we see that a lot of native Polish artists and thinkers emerged. I didn't get into any of them here because I feel like this video is already running a bit long, but there were quite a few who would emerge from that. And Poland, actually, because of its dedication to learning at this time, would have one of the earlier printing presses in Europe. The printing press was only really invented around 1440, and Poland already had one in place by 1473, so they were pretty on the ball with that. So now that we've mentioned the printing press, let's talk about it in more detail. Let's end our discussion of the Renaissance by looking at the development of the printing press in Europe and how this would allow all of the intellectual gains made during the Renaissance to be perpetuated going forward, and how learning would only increase and expand because of the availability of cheaper books. So the printing press actually goes back to China. It was developed there at a much earlier date, but it was only really brought to Europe and then perfected in a semi-modern form by Johannes Gutenberg, who was a goldsmith living in the Holy Roman Empire. And he made his printing press around 1440, and he used metallic type. So the long-term effect of this, because he basically made his to make Bibles, but over time, this printing press and the more developed, more sophisticated versions that would follow it would greatly increase the amount of reading material available and also drastically reduce the cost. Because if you'll recall, the way of making most texts during antiquity and the Middle Ages is to have a scriptorium where you have someone read aloud and have people copy, or you have monks working in isolation copying text by hand in silence. So clearly this method, way more efficient and ultimately a lot cheaper once you have the materials on hand and you have people using cheaper forms of paper rather than relying on vellum or papyrus or anything like that. So anyway, that is the Renaissance. Hopefully this has been useful and helpful, and you now have a good general understanding of what the Renaissance was.